I'm sure you know that physicists nowadays believe in subatomic particles, and I'm sure you also know that this hasn't always been the case. One thing you may not have realized is that you can actually sort of tell from the meaning of the word atom that physicists or natural philosophers haven't always believed in subatomic particles. What atom means, at least etymologically, is uncuttable or indivisible. So there was a time when natural philosophers called something an atom that they meant something that is not composed of smaller entities, that is the smallest possible bit of matter. Well, we're studying atomism in the 5th century BCE, and in particular Leucippus and Democritus. They offered mechanistic explanations for natural phenomena that made use of their atomism. A mechanistic explanation of something points to what came before and what of necessity will follow from that thing. The primary form of explanation at that point, and in fact this was common through Newton, was a teleological explanation. A teleological explanation explains something with reference to an end goal. So if a stone falls to earth when it's unsupported in the air, a teleological explanation might say this: the reason it fell to earth was that, well, it was seeking the center of the earth. Okay, that was its aim. If we want to explain why, for example, Da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, well, one sort of explanation, a mechanistic one, might point to a desire that he had, and then to paint being applied to canvas. But a teleological explanation would point to the end goal, okay, the end goal of this work of art, and that would explain why he painted it. Well, teleological explanations, as I said, were the commonest in the 5th century BCE, but Leucippus and Democritus offered mechanistic ones, and their mechanistic explanations appealed to the motion of atoms in the void. Okay, so those are the two kinds of things that they thought existed, were atoms and the void. These atoms, though they're the smallest possible bits of matter, actually were shaped differently and had different textures. Okay, and so that is how, in their view, they could sort of hang together, at least temporarily, and form these compound entities. So trees, tables, chairs, etc., were just a whole bunch of atoms appearing tree-wise or table-wise or chair-wise. So they had different textures, different shapes, and that's how they temporarily hung together. Now, one thing that this atomic theory did for them was explain how perception works. In their view, when we perceive something, what's happening is that atoms from an object are somehow falling off it and hitting our sensory organs. Okay, so when we see something, okay, if you see a mug, what's happening is that somehow these atoms that were part of this compound that is the mug are somehow being emitted from it and are actually hitting your eyes. When you hear something, atoms are entering your ears. When you taste something, they're hitting your tongue. And in their view, they explain different sorts of flavors by the different textures that atoms have. So if you've got like a rough atoms, that could actually, in their view, it could sort of cut the tongue in these very microscopic ways, and that would actually give you a sort of bitter taste. So that is one thing that they thought that their atomic theory could do, was explain how sensation worked. So they had scientific reasons for being atomists. They also had a philosophical reason. Okay, and the main philosophical reason was that it could give them, in their view, a successful response to Zeno, whom we've been studying. Zeno, you'll recall, argues that motion is impossible. So, for example, movement from where I am to across the room, well, here on Zeno's view, here's what that would take. I would first have to move halfway across the room before I can get all the way. I got to move at least halfway. But before I can move halfway, I've got to move a quarter of the way. And before I can move a quarter of the way, I have to move an eighth of the way. And before I can move an eighth of the way, I have to move a 16th of the way, and so on ad infinitum. Okay, we can always divide a halfway point in half, and then that half we can divide in half again an infinite number of times. And so, according to Zeno, I would actually have to perform an infinite number of tasks because to get across the room, because there are an infinite number of points between myself and the other side of the room. But he says, but I can't perform an infinite number of tasks. No one can. And therefore motion has got to be an illusion. Okay? Well, the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, they deny a premise in that argument. In their atomism, one of the uses that they're putting it to is to show that no, Zeno's argument goes wrong. It goes wrong with the premise that says there are an infinite number of points between myself and the other side of the room, or between any two objects in space. Now, why is that wrong? The floor between myself and the other side of the room can't be divided an infinite number of times. There is a limit to division. Okay, division of physical stuff on their view. It gets to a point where it can't be cut any further, and that's the atom. Okay, so the number of tasks I have to complete to get to the other side of the room just depends on how many atoms can fit between myself and the other side of the room. Okay, and I don't actually have to traverse an infinite number of points, but only a finite number. And for that reason, they say this claim that we can't do an infinite number of things. They would say, well, that's true, but you don't have to. Okay, motion doesn't require that. Okay, because space, contrary to Zeno, can't be divided up an infinite number of times. So that's one use. Okay, one use for their the main philosophical use for their atomic theory is to refute, or at least challenge, the argument from Zeno that motion is an illusion. Now, so that is one reason they have for believing in atoms, is that atoms can account for motion. As I said, they also believe in the void. So what exists falls into sort of two categories of things. Either it's an atom or it's the void, or non-being. Why believe in the void? A couple reasons. One, actually several reasons, but I mentioned just two in the notes that you have. One is that things, at least many things, are compressible. Okay, if you've got, I don't know, a sponge or something, you can make it smaller by squeezing it. How could that happen? Unless there was non-being somehow in that sponge, and that allowed the atoms that are making the sponge to move, to compress. Okay, there could be no compression if everything was full of being and there was no void. Secondly, motion. Okay, so motion seems to require that there be parts of existence that are not filled. Okay, there has to be parts of it that are just the void. So since there is motion, in their view, at least that's a very sort of common sense thing to say, the void requires requires the void. Okay, without the void, there could be no motion. So they believe in two things. They believe in atoms, and they believe in the void. And these things these supply them with an answer to Zeno's paradoxes, okay, that say that there is no motion. Now, there are a couple things that might trouble us about this. Here's one thing. Motion, in their view, requires the void. Okay, and that's one of two kinds of thing that exists in reality. But the void is what is not. So you might say, what are you talking about when we say there is something that is non-being? Okay, that seems like a contradiction. And this actually isn't just an ancient sort of problem, or a problem in the interpretation of ancient philosophy. Even to this day, it's an interesting puzzle. What do we want to say about space between physical objects? Is it itself a sort of thing? Can we say that it's non-being? Does that even make sense to say that it's non-being? Okay, so that's a trouble for them, and it's actually a trouble to this day. Secondly, they say that atoms are the smallest bit of matter, and they can't be cut. Is it possible, though, for there to be something that is extended in space, that is, that takes up space, that can't be cut? Now, they need to say, and they do say, that atoms take up space. Because if atoms didn't take up space, if they were just points, Well, a whole bunch of atoms that don't take up space add up to a compound of atoms that also doesn't take up space. Okay? And so you have to have the individual atoms taking up space in order to get, say, tables and chairs. But how could it be that something that actually is extended can't even in principle be divided? It seems like at least an omnipotent being, that God, could divide something that is extended in space. So those are two difficulties for them. Okay, what should we say about the void? And then secondly, can we really take seriously the claim that the smallest unit of matter is extended in space, but yet for some reason can't be cut? And why on earth would it be true that it can't be cut?